For those of you who may not be familiar with Pew, the Pew Charitable Trust is a large public charity. It's one of the largest ones in the United States. It's got about $5 billion or so of assets, and it works to use data to drive good governing policies, like Swati mentioned Janaagraha does here in India, to move beyond the anecdote, to use data to actually drive policies that help improve the life of citizens, to lower taxpayer costs while also improving service. Some of you might be asking, why did we focus so much of our energy on voter lists in the United States? And what our research indicated was that voter lists are where many of the problems that occur throughout the electoral process originate. Problems with the voter lists, inaccuracies or a lack of completeness, infect the entire process all the way down through election day and through election results. So whether you're the world's oldest democracy or the world's largest democracy, there are challenges that we must face when we're dealing with the voter list. To give you an idea of the challenges we face in the U.S., as you know, the U.S. is made up of 50 states plus the District of Columbia, and each of those states has its own election rules, its own election laws, and compiles its own voter lists. In addition, within those 50 states, there are over 10,000 independent electoral entities, usually run at the county level in the United States, and so this complicates the process, the decentralization. Now, what I'll do is run through some headlines here that came up just in the 30 days before the presidential election that we just had in November of 2012. These are all headlines, and I don't know if you can see them all, relating to problems with the voter lists in the United States, and this is just a small sampling of the problems that we've seen in the course of an election season, and this is just in the 30 days right before the election. So we did research on this, and what we determined, we have a report that we put up on our website, is that the lists are suffering from inaccuracies, they're way too costly to maintain, and they're widely inefficient. We entitled this report Inaccurate, Costly, and Inefficient. And what we found was, first of all, with regard to accuracy, about 24 million records on the list in the United States are no longer up to date. That's about 1 in 8 active registrations in the United States. This is almost entirely due to mobility. Many people move in between election cycles, and as I'll show you in some of these slides, it's very difficult to maintain the list and keep up with that mobility in between election cycles. About 12.7 million records are out of date. About 1.8 million deceased individuals are on the list. About 12 million records have inaccurate addresses. And all told, once you get rid of the duplicates, that's where you get to the 24 million number. In fact, there are a lot of people registered in more than one state. This is not because people intentionally register in more than one state. What occurs is people naturally move between the states and between election cycles. And while it's easy for them to get on the list in their new state, it's very difficult to remove that record from the old state. What we have is a lack of communication between the states to keep their lists up to date. So while someone might get on the list in their new state, very difficult to keep that record up to date in the old state. Why is this a problem in the United States? As I mentioned, the number one reason is mobility. About 1 in 8 Americans moves in any given year, and some American populations are much more mobile than that. Military personnel, young people, and as we just experienced in the U.S., the economic downturn caused a great deal of mobility. About 1 in 4 young Americans moves in any given year. That mobility is very, very difficult to keep up with. And then in between presidential election cycles, about 30% of the American population moves. Now, I'm going to show you a series of charts here. That mobility is a particular challenge because the way the American voter thinks about voter registration, and that burden of voter registration falls on the voter. It does not fall on government. The voter has to get themselves onto the list. And they only really think about voter registration in the United States right before a presidential election. We have many, many elections in any given year in the United States. We have congressional elections in between presidential elections, but really we only think about voter registration in the 30 days before a presidential election cycle. So this is the state of Maryland, where I happen to live. And if you look, those big spikes are right before the presidential elections of 2000, 2004, and 2008. Outside of those spikes, there's very little activity that's going on beyond just the average ordinary activity. So basically what we see in the United States is if someone moves in December right after a presidential election, say in December of 2012, it's very unlikely that election officials in the United States are going to know about that until October of 2016. So there's all this churn going on in the voter rolls that election officials won't know about. In the meantime, they're making plans, they're drawing precinct lines, they're sending mail out to these voters, and it's very inefficient. So just to give you an idea that this isn't, it's not just happening in Maryland, this is also Virginia, where you see a big spike right before the 2008 presidential election, and similarly in Colorado, where you see a big spike right before the 2008 presidential election as well. So with regard to efficiency, we have some voter confusion issues as well. Because the burden falls on the voter, it's very important for the voters to know how the rules work, but voters don't really understand why voter registration doesn't follow them when they move. What we find is about 1 in 4 voters in the US assumes their registration follows them automatically when they move, so they don't have to do anything to fix it, which is wrong, of course. About half of voters don't realize that when they go into a motor vehicles agency, which is really the primary point of contact for most citizens in the United States with government, when they move, they do think to go to motor vehicles to update their driver's license, but they don't think to do anything with their voter registration. They're supposed to be able to do that at motor vehicles, but about half of voters don't realize they can. And this leads to actually lost votes. What we found in the 2008 and 2012 election cycles is that millions of lost votes were the result of bad voter registration information. Someone didn't get the right voter registration information onto the list. They went to try to cast their ballot, and they weren't able to cast a ballot that would be counted due to a problem with the lists. The result, about 51 million, or about 25% of the American eligible voter population, is not on the list at all. So we've done research on this, and we worked with election officials and other experts to promote a solution to this. And the solution has 3 parts, all of which harness technology to better keep the lists up to date and make them more complete. First, because the burden is on the voter, it's important that there be a convenient way to get for the voters to update their information. So many states have pioneered what we call online voter registration. Voter registration in the United States, the vast majority of them are still done by paper. Paper, pen, and postal mail, the 3 Ps as I call them. It's one of the last places in government that you have to actually go find a particular paper government form in the United States from a government official, fill it out by hand in ink, and hand it back to a government official. Automating what I call the motor voter registration process. As I mentioned, they're supposed to offer voter registration services at motor vehicles agencies. This is done very poorly across the United States. Automating that process will help build that more efficiently. And then finally, creating a system so the states can better track mobility between the states, which they can't do right now, so to do better data sharing between the states. I'll talk about each of these very briefly. First, with regard to online voter registration, we know that it's more accurate. As you can imagine, when you have people filling out paper forms and handing them in to a government official, that involves an extra step in the process. Someone needs to then take those forms, often decipher the illegible handwriting, and enter them by hand into a database. With online registration, the information goes directly into the database, and it's confirmed by the person who cares most about its accuracy, the voter themselves. It costs a lot less. What we find is that paper registrations cost around 83 cents to $2 on average in the United States, whereas an online registration costs 3 cents or less per registration. And then voters prefer it. About 4 to 5 registrations in states that have had this for a while. Arizona is a good example. The voters choose to use online registration in those states. And it's also a trend that is continuing to grow in the U.S. While only 2 states, Arizona and Washington, used it in 2008, 13 states had it available to their voters, including California, in the 2012 election cycle, and that'll be growing in the coming years. Automating the motor voter process is very important. As I mentioned, it's the point at which citizens have a natural interaction with government, even when they might not have any other interaction with government directly, when they physically present themselves to a government agency, particularly after a life event. They've moved, they've changed names as a result of marriage, for instance, or divorce. These are very important interactions to capture in the voter registration database on the voter lists, as well as at motor vehicles. And this is a very good opportunity to do that. And then lastly, the better data sharing through a data center we've built at Pew in partnership with the states that we call the Electronic Registration Information Center, or ERIC. And what this is designed to do is try to help states who didn't have the capacity to track mobility between the states before to help them do that. It's a sophisticated data matching tool. We've been working with our partners at IBM to build that. We're using a data matching piece of software that is very new. We're one of the very first to be able to use this, and it's very adept at finding a record from one individual in one state and being able to match it to an individual in another state. As you might be able to imagine, that's a very difficult thing to do. You have often limited data points on which you can match. So being able to take multiple data sources and match them simultaneously across multiple fields is very important. And what the participating states get is high-quality data that basically tells them this voter has moved, this voter has died, and they can then start the process to clean up the rolls and get high-quality data directly from the voter to update their record. Just to give you an idea, the system was just built less than a year ago, and 7 states used it in the 2012 election, including several states which, if you follow American politics, were very much very close calls for the presidential election, Colorado, Nevada, and Virginia. And we saw some remarkably good results from that in the first run-through. So what we get from all this is more accurate lists, first of all. We keep up with a mobile electorate. We better identify voters who have died. We find and reconcile duplicates. As you can imagine, there are a lot of duplicate records where people, as I mentioned, have records across state lines or even in the same state where they just haven't caught the duplicate. There are significant cost savings, much reduced printing costs, a reduction in returned mail. There's a lot of election mail that goes out and a lot of it gets returned. That costs a lot of money to process. Fewer what we call provisional ballots in the United States. These are challenged ballots, ballots that are set aside for special counting. It's very costly and burdensome to count those. And then lastly, it's more efficient. Records are more up to date when the change occurs, not just right before the presidential election. So what you see is what we call flattening that curve. So you see that spike. We hope to tamp down that spike to see more activity between election cycles. A lot less paper, much more efficient for that reason. And then what we aim to do is get more eligible voters on the rolls, but only eligible voters on the rolls. So both the enfranchising aspect of democracy, having more people on the list is served, but also those who are worried about the integrity of the process are also satisfied because the lists are more accurate and reflect only the true electorate. So you can find further information on our website there, or feel free to contact me at my email address. Thank you.